Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us bright and early on this Monday morning, where we're going to talk today about how your utility can access this Clean Water State Revolving Fund funding to build infrastructure in your communities. Okay, really quickly, just some background on who we are. I know a lot of you, but if you're not familiar with us, we are the Southwest Environmental Finance Center, and we're technical assistance providers, much like RCAC, Communities Unlimited, Rural Water Association, so you might be familiar with those. So we do provide technical assistance to water and wastewater utilities throughout the country. And we are part of the UNM, University of New Mexico School of Engineering, here in fabulous Albuquerque, New Mexico. You can see the Rio Grande right there and the Sandia Mountains. And that's our building right there, Centennial Engineering Center. And you can see it's in my background here. I think I've got the same picture. So that's who we are. Just real quick, so why are we here? What makes us able to provide this assistance and this training to you today? This is all part of our tribal wastewater program. For a long time, we've been able to offer assistance to tribal drinking water systems in EPA Region 6 through EPA out of Dallas for over 20 years. But now we're able to offer assistance to tribal nations and wastewater utilities in EPA Region 6, 7, and 8. And so this program is all about providing training and technical assistance in terms of wastewater to help you build your internal capacity to operate and maintain your wastewater utilities. It's all about helping you comply with environmental regulations to protect public health and the environment. And a big part of this program is helping your communities access funding for wastewater infrastructure. And so that's what we're talking about today, is getting that funding to build the facilities that you need. You can learn more on our website and request assistance through our website. There's a quick reference code up on the screen there. But if you'd like to learn more about the program and see some of the past events that we're having and some of the future events, you can go to that website and get the assistance that you need. We've reached out to a lot of you already, but we haven't reached out to everyone. If you have not heard from us yet, please reach out to us, but eventually we will be contacting you to find out how we can be of assistance. Okay, again, the first part of the program is providing needs assessments. So looking at what sort of training and assistance needs you might have in your community, and also to understand what your current wastewater infrastructure looks like, what needs aren't being met by your current wastewater infrastructure, and then seeing how we can help you get funding to put wastewater infrastructure in place. We're also all about peer-to-peer learning, so learning from others that have already done this sort of thing. And we are doing training and assistance for building your technical, managerial, and financial capacity. All right. So this is part of our wastewater infrastructure funding webinar series. Our first episode in that series took place a couple of months ago. You can click on that link there. And again, we will provide the slides to you. But we had an overview of infrastructure funding opportunities for tribal water utilities. It's on YouTube. Today, we're talking about the Clean Water State Revolving Fund. October 29th, my colleague Tucker Colvin, who is on today, will be talking about very specific state funding opportunities for tribal nations in Montana, South Dakota, and North Dakota. So that will be in 1 month on October 29th. So we will be sending out an announcement for that webinar after this training so that you can go ahead and get registered if you're at a tribal nation in Montana, South Dakota, and North Dakota. We will also have future webinars on other state-specific funding opportunities for tribal nations. If you're not in one of those other states, we will have a webinar for your state. And we will also have other trainings on like managing your grant after award or working with contractors. And so those will be future webinars that we will be providing. All right, so without further ado, I guess, I'd like to introduce my colleague, Shannon Sloan Pepper. She will be providing the training today. She's a research scientist here at the Southwest Environmental Finance Center. She's a trainer and a technical assistance provider. So go ahead, Shannon.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks so much for coming today. It's really nice to see some familiar faces in the video cams there. And thanks also for introducing yourself in the chat. That's really great to just know who's here this morning and who's interested in the Clean Water State Revolving Fund. We'll get into some details, but as Matt said, my name is Shannon Sloan Pepper, and I work for the Southwest Environmental Finance Center. Been doing Clean Water State Revolving Fund assistance for small systems for the last couple of years. And I'm really excited to share what I know with you all today. So here's the agenda that we're gonna go over first. What is the Clean Water State Revolving Fund? Do a quick overview, just some general information about what it is. Then we'll get into what makes a fundable or eligible project for the Clean Water State Revolving Fund. And then finally, we'll talk about how to actually go about applying for this program. And we're not going to go into a whole bunch of detail today. We only have about 45 minutes left. So it's going to be a kind of quick and dirty overview. And just know that there are lots and lots of resources and previous webinars out there with more detailed information. But if you have any questions throughout the presentation, there's not so many of us here today. Please feel free to unmute or put your question in the chat just as I'm presenting. We'll also try to keep a few minutes at the end of the presentation to do some question and answer. So you can also hold your questions for the end, whatever you prefer. I want to make sure this is interactive, so feel free to interrupt me at any point. I don't mind. Okay, so let's go over what is the Clean Water State Revolving Fund. First of all, what is the deal with this funding program? Why would you consider or bother applying for it? There's a lot of funding opportunities out there, but this one is kind of particular, and it's also received a whole bunch of money recently. So it's kind of on people's minds, I think. So the state revolving fund programs are essentially water infrastructure banks. They provide low interest loans to eligible recipients for drinking water and wastewater and stormwater projects. So basically the way it works is the federal government, so the EPA in this case, awards money each year in the form of grants to each state. And the states will then distribute the money in their fund through the state revolving fund programs. Now the recipient of the loan, once they receive it, pays that loan back at a very low to no interest rate. And then the money is repurposed into another loan for another system and so on. So in this way, it revolves and grows over time is the idea. Now, before I lose anyone to the word loan, please just know that in all states, there are grant-like dollars in these programs for underserved, disadvantaged or tribal applicants. And we'll talk more about that later. But just know that although this is primarily a loan program, there is additional subsidy money available for certain systems. So there are also two types of state revolving fund programs. The one that we're going to be talking about today and focusing on is the Clean Water State Revolving Fund. The Clean Water Fund refers to both wastewater and stormwater projects. And this fund is aimed at addressing issues related to water quality particularly. And that can mean a lot of things when it comes to project eligibilities. So I'll say more on that later. And then the CWSRF, or the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund, pertains to drinking water projects. So these are projects that must have a public health benefit. And then at the state level, the Clean Water and Drinking Water State Revolving Funds are often administered by different state level organizations. Now, of course, you know, public health and water quality are related, they're interconnected. But for the purposes of these funds, and when you go to apply for them and thinking about, you know, where does my project fall? Think with clean water, you're thinking about wastewater, stormwater projects that relate to improving water quality. And then drinking water projects are related to public health. And today, as I said, we're focusing on the clean water side of things. So the Clean Water State Revolving Funds, the way they work, as I said, Congress is the one who holds the purse in this case, and Congress awards money to the EPA Clean Water State Revolving Fund. And there is recently a huge injection of money into this federal level fund through the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, which is also known as the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. So this act basically infused $11.7 billion of just general funding into this program, plus $1 billion specifically to address emerging contaminants. And a lot of that money is grant or subsidy money for systems. Then we make it down to congressionally directed spending. Now, this is a kind of intermediate step between the federal government giving or granting money to the states. So the congressionally directed spending, essentially a little bit of that Clean Water State Revolving Fund money is shaved, taken for personal, not personal projects, but projects that Congress people are particularly working on in different communities. So that is water and wastewater related funding, but it sort of bypasses the state level Clean Water State Revolving Funds. It's pretty complicated, so that's all I'm going to say about that for now. But let me know if you have any questions, particularly about congressionally directed spending. Anyway, then once that money is taken, it makes it down into the Clean Water State Revolving Fund at a state level. When I just saw a question, what is an emerging contaminant? That's a really good question. So emerging contaminants are, the EPA considers an emerging contaminant a pollutant or like some kind of hazardous material in the water that isn't yet regulated. So there may be some preliminary studies on it, but it doesn't yet have federal or state level regulation associated with it. So one example of that, right, is PFAS that you've heard of probably. PFAS is one of those like big emerging contaminants. And thanks, Tucker. He plugged a link into the chat there. So if you have more questions about that, please go ahead and check out EPA's website on emerging contaminants. So the Clean Water State Revolving Fund is a program. It's a federal state partnership, and it provides communities low interest financing for a wide variety of water quality infrastructure projects. And if you want to see a kind of cool animation that describes this process, if you're more of a visual learner like me, you can go ahead and check out this link. This is a link to one of the animations that somebody on our staff did to describe the SRF process and what it actually kind of looks like in animation form. It's pretty fun. So the Clean Water Act amendments of 1987 is what really kicked off the Clean Water State Revolving Fund. They essentially created state-by-state revolving funds and provided guidance and limitations to how each state was able to or allowed to use those funds. And that remains true. So each state in our country, plus Puerto Rico, decides exactly how to divvy up that money that they get from the federal government. And the key to understanding the state revolving fund programs is really knowing that there are a few aspects that hold true for all states, but most of the details of how and when and where those funds are distributed are really up to each state to decide. So states will often use that flexibility that's allowed by the EPA to promote the kinds of activities that they want to see more of in their state. And that's why you're going to see so much variability and difference between each state program and the Clean Water State Revolving Funds. So, by the numbers here, Clean Water State Revolving Fund has $153.6 billion in funding, and up to 2021, 44,555 loan agreements were signed. So this is a really big project, or big program, and it's funding a lot of projects, and it's actually grown a whole lot in recent years as well. There are some really key advantages here to Clean Water State Revolving Fund money. For one thing, there's lots of money available, especially since the bipartisan infrastructure law re-infused this program with a bunch of new federal money. There's also principal forgiveness available for disadvantaged communities. And in loan terms, what principal forgiveness is essentially, you take out a loan, but then there's an agreement that you don't necessarily have to pay back all of that loan. Maybe you don't have to pay back any of that loan. That would be 100% principal forgiveness. Maybe you have to pay 75% of that loan back. So it really just depends, again, state by state and like what their subsidy programs are like. But that is often available in each state is principal forgiveness. There's also a bunch of new money, as I said, for emerging contaminants, and that is particularly addressing things like PFAS. I think lead is also considered an emerging contaminant just because we are now understanding how harmful it can be in water systems, particularly. There's also a very low interest rate in these loan programs. We're talking about 0 to 1%. I know here in New Mexico, the loan rate is about 0.01%, so very, very low interest rate. And that's kind of useful because you can also use the Clean Water State Revolving Fund to refinance your existing loans. And because of these really low interest rates, that's a pretty advantageous way to use these funds. There are also up to 30-year loan terms, so pretty long loan terms, usually 20 to 30 years, unless the asset that you're planning to fund with this program has a shorter lifespan, in which case the loan will last through the expected lifespan of that asset that you're funding. There's also a huge amount of flexibility in this program. There's a really wide range of eligible projects, and we'll go into that in a bit more detail in the next section here. But that's a pretty big advantage to this program as well. Now, there are some disadvantages also that I want you all to be aware of. So again, this is a loan program, so it's not a grant program, although there are, like I said, grant-like dollars available. It is still a loan, which means that it's subjected to, eligibility loan requirements, things like that. It's also not particularly tailored for tribal entities. Tribal entities are welcome to apply, but you will be competing with all other kinds of utilities. There's not a subsection within the Clean Water State Revolving Fund that's just for tribes. So that's one thing. And then also you're required to provide financial records. And this can really be a barrier for smaller systems who might not have kept all of their financial records, might not have ever done any kind of audit or financial review. So that is going to be a requirement because it is a loan program. There's also pretty limited principal forgiveness. As I said, principal forgiveness is a part of most states' programs, but it is limited. It's not a grant program. Also, there are federal requirements. So as with any federal money, there's going to be hoops that you have to jump through as a system, things like the Davis-Bacon Act, the Build America, Buy America, these kinds of things. So all of those federal requirements and cross-cutters are going to apply here. And there's a lot of them, but there's also a lot of there's a lot of assistance available. As Matt said, we're here to help with those kinds of things, but they are present in this program. Let's get into what types of projects are eligible for Clean Water State Revolving Fund money. And you might be surprised by the answer. So there are 11 eligible project types. They have to meet one of these 11 criteria, and these are pretty broad criteria, as you can probably see. So in addition, each project has to be implemented in accordance with different sections of the Clean Water Act. Remember, I said that the Clean Water Act founded this funding program. So there are 4 broad categories of federally mandated eligibility criteria under 4 sections of the Clean Water Act. So we've got section 212, section 319, 320, and 122. Now, 212 is construction of publicly owned treatment works and security measures at publicly owned treatment works. 212 is definitely what you would think of as like a traditional wastewater infrastructure project, and a lot of most probably applications in most states for the Clean Water State Revolving Fund fall under section 212 eligibility. Then we've got section 319, which is non-point source pollution section of the Clean Water State Revolving Fund. We've also got the ability to fund national estuary program projects. So if your entity falls under what's considered to be a national estuary, then you could be eligible for section 320 projects. There's also section 122 watershed pilot projects. And then you've also got the Green Project Reserve. And so this is another federally mandated section of the CWSRF. And every state has to have some kind of green project reserve. That could be stormwater projects, water conservation efficiency and reuse projects, could be water reuse, could be decentralized wastewater treatment systems. So that's also known as septic systems. So a lot of some states will use their green project reserve money to fund septic programs in their state. There's also money set aside for technical assistance. And that is required. So all states have to have some kind of technical assistance program for small and disadvantaged communities. That is required. So let's go into a little bit more detail on these different sections. So eligibility section 212, we're talking about publicly owned treatment works. As I said, this is what you probably think of as a standard wastewater infrastructure project. Could be installing new pumps, could be installing lift stations, could be installing a new treatment system or treatment plant. And for these types of projects, we're talking about treatment works, gray infrastructure. We're talking about potentially climate change mitigation projects that also can fall under 212, and projects that deal with flooding, although do keep in mind, so for climate change mitigation and flooding issues, you really have to frame your Clean Water State Revolving Fund application in terms of water quality improvements. So if you say if all you say is we've got flooding issues, probably they're going to say, go apply for FEMA funding. Which is what you would do after some kind of climate disaster. When we're talking about the Clean Water State Revolving Fund, you want to talk about it in terms of water quality issues that you're solving with your project. There's also energy conservation through water efficiency. So updating your plant to be more water efficient or including efficiency measures in your project that you're planning, that's going to be able to be funded. Also, inflow and infiltration correction as well, things that are reducing the load on your public sewer systems. And eligible borrowers for this section are only public and municipal entities. So that does include tribal governments, but no privately owned treatment operations can apply through this project section. Now let's talk a little bit about section 319. So this is a big one, and it's pretty underutilized so far, which I think is a bit of a shame because it's quite a flexible section. There's a lot of things that you can fund under Section 319, Clean Water State Revolving Fund. So things like, Section 319 again is a non-point source project. So non-point source, just to make sure we're all on the same page here. Non-point source pollution is what occurs when you have rainfall or irrigation that runs over the land and picks up contaminants or pollutants and carries them into your water bodies, your water sources, things like this. And it's the kind of pollution where if you couldn't, point your finger and say, that's where the pollution is coming from. It's coming from that plant or that operation or whatever. It's that kind of diffuse pollution. And it's really difficult to control. It makes it really difficult to identify the source of pollution. So this section of the CWSRF is aimed at addressing that type of pollution. It's generally associated with agriculture, it could be forestry, urban areas, marinas, that kind of thing. And these pollutants really contribute quite substantially to water quality degradation, which is why it falls under this section of the Clean Water State Revolving Fund. So things like green stormwater infrastructure, agricultural best management practices, resource extraction, so particularly looking at water quality recovery after resource extraction, decentralized wastewater treatment, also known as septic systems, could fall under this. Also contaminated sites and landfills, things like that, could be used for habitat protection and restoration, types of silviculture and forestry if it addresses a water quality concern. Also desalination, things like treatment or disposal of brine or treatment, like reinjection of brackish groundwater. Also groundwater projects, so protecting or restoring aquifers, water conservation, water reuse, that kind of thing. And then there's also surface water protection and restoration. So in addition to everything we already just talked about, eligible projects could be land and water rights acquisitions to protect water quality. So again, huge range of projects. Just make sure that you're thinking, like, is this a project that directly addresses water quality? And in that case, it's probably fundable. So borrowers for this section of the CWSRF can actually be any kind of borrower. So municipalities, could be nonprofits, could be for-profits. And then repayment sources can be sometimes a little bit trickier. So if, in the case of a municipality, if you're charging a fee or you have funding from the tribal government or whatever, that's probably what you would use to repay your loan. But if you're a nonprofit entity, you might be looking at repayment sources like stormwater fees, recreational fees, donations, business revenue, taxes, these kinds of things. Any of those are possible, but you have to get a little more creative if you're not charging a utility fee. And in this section of the Clean Water State Revolving Fund, 38 million was invested in projects in 2021, which might seem like a pretty small cut of that multi-billion-dollar cake. And that's part of that is because these projects tend to not be quite as capital intensive as treatment plant improvements. So that's one reason. Also, as I said, it's kind of an underutilized section of the Clean Water State Revolving Fund, but one I think is important to mention. Now, there are a few things that cannot be funded through the Clean Water State Revolving Fund. I just want to make sure that we're clear on that. So operations and maintenance or O&M activities are not able to be funded by the Clean Water State Revolving Fund. And most states really don't budge on this. That's true across all states and programs. There's also no lending to individuals. So individual person applying is not going to be able to be lended to. But you could potentially develop what's called a pass-through lending program. So what that is essentially, I've seen this used for septic system improvement. So, with septic systems, you might have a bunch of individual homeowners who are on septic, maybe all that whole community of septic owners need to improve their septic systems in order to improve groundwater quality, for instance. If you've got a lot of contamination from defunct septic systems, maybe you might want to develop what's called a pass-through lending program. So essentially, what that is an entity in the community applies to the Clean Water State Revolving Fund to develop a loan program that they can then run to hand money to individual homeowners or lend money to individual homeowners to improve their septic systems. And that's how that kind of works. And then anything without a direct water quality benefit. So again, if you can't think or point to a water quality benefit, it probably is not fundable by the Clean Water State Revolving Fund. Okay. So that's eligibilities. Let's go into what it takes to apply for the Clean Water State Revolving Fund, where you should start, and what are the things that you should be looking for. There are a lot of things that you will want to be aware of if you decide you want to apply for CWSRF. And you're going to want to gather this information before you apply. It's going to help you submit a more successful application if you have some understanding of the process and what's going to be required throughout the process. You want to waste your time applying if you don't know exactly where you're headed. So let's start with the intended use plan. And that's basically a one-stop shop for most of the important information that you're going to need in this process. So all states have to prepare an intended use plan, or an IUP, which identifies the intended uses of their state revolving fund money and describes how those uses support the overall goals of the SRF. So things that you will find in the intended use plan include the short and long-term goals of that state's program, how much money is available that year, so the sources, and then how the state's going to intend to use that money that is granted to them from the EPA. Loan rates and terms. You're going to see also project ranking criteria, so how states are going to rank projects and applications that they receive in relation to other projects and applications. Usually there's a point system, and usually that point system is transparent. Like states will post their ranking criteria online so that and they will also post how they're going to basically choose and rank projects that they receive. And then there's also in the intended use plan the additional subsidy money that the state is planning to distribute and how. They're also going to have disadvantaged or also known as affordability criteria. So how they're going to determine who qualifies as disadvantaged. And then they're also going to have what's called readiness to proceed criteria. And sometimes that readiness to proceed basically means how ready are you to put boots on the ground and start your project? So have you met all of those federal requirements? Do you have all of the documentation in order? Do you have your people chosen? Like these kinds of things. And that will sometimes fall under priority ranking criteria as well. So the IUP is prepared annually, and it's subjected to public comment and review before the state submits it to the EPA. I recommend that you look up and become familiar with your state's, whatever state you fall into, their particular criteria, and make sure that you know what you're getting into when you apply for this program. So once you have kind of gone over the IUP a bit, you'll want to know if your project is eligible for additional subsidy, probably. And this could significantly help you out financially. So there are 4 main categories for subsidies. And every year, states will use these additional subsidies for grants or loan forgiveness or other kinds of projects. And the amounts of additional subsidy will range between 10 to 40% usually of whatever the federal government granted your state. So they can make up a significant portion of your state's program, up to 40%. So 4 main categories for subsidies. One is affordability or disadvantaged community. One is stormwater. And then you have energy or water efficiency projects, and also sustainable project planning, design, and construction. Now, states could decide to subsidize, any different kinds of projects like green infrastructure versus gray infrastructure. Energy and water efficiency projects, could be some way that your system is deciding to save energy or water. I know some states will direct their subsidy into things like pre-development loan funds and go ahead and subsidize those. So your state's intended use plan should detail which projects are proposed to receive additional subsidy each year. And I also know, for example, that Illinois is using some of their subsidy money for regionalization projects, so partnerships between wastewater systems. Texas is targeting green infrastructure projects, emergency preparedness, and very small systems. So this really varies state by state, and that you're going to be able to find that information in your state's intended use plan. Now let's talk a little bit about disadvantaged community, or also known as affordability criteria. So the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund usually uses the term disadvantaged communities, while the Clean Water State Revolving Fund usually uses the term affordability. Affordability is it's a term that was used in the original Clean Water Act, and it's held out in some states. Some states are still using that term. Others have started using disadvantaged or something similar because it's a little more descriptive of what the program actually does. But in all programs, this basically means a community that's going to have a hard time paying back a loan and is vulnerable or struggling in some way. And states will develop their own criteria for disadvantaged or affordability communities. It's generally based on income, unemployment, and or population trends. A lot of states are in the process of revising their definitions and their criteria, and they're generally using things like census tract data, median household income, that kind of thing. What you see on the screen here is the climate and economic justice screening tool. This can be another thing that states will use to sort of highlight communities that are going to be particularly vulnerable, might not be able to pay back a loan, but need the infrastructure. The link to this tool is on the screen. This can also be helpful to making a case for your community being disadvantaged, even if you don't meet one of the general requirements, the general population requirements. Although also in other states, as Matt just wrote, tribal nations already meet the disadvantaged community criteria. And so generally, if you're here, you probably qualify. And then there are some other factors that states will also use to determine disadvantaged or affordability status. So one can be percent of population in poverty, could be percent of population over 64, could be if it's an environmental justice area or EJ area. That screening tool on the last slide would be something that would indicate that. Percent not in the labor force, percent with SNAP benefits, could be home sale rates or customer utility customer bill delinquency, things like this. And here's just a quick example of what that can look like. This is New Mexico's revised affordability criteria. They revised this last year. This is the draft version that was open for public comment in 2023. So the affordability criteria, again, here you can see it's hitting those three main categories: income, population, unemployment, and it's, the total points possible in this criteria program, as you can see in the bottom there, is 150, but you only need 50 points in order to qualify as an affordability or disadvantaged community. So you don't need to meet all of those requirements, you just need to meet one. And then let's also look at an example of an application process. So I picked Colorado. They have a pretty clear but also in-depth application process. And again, this is another place where all states are going to be a little bit different. So I didn't want to, put a general application process because they really do vary a lot. But I think that this example shows the types of things that you're likely to see during an application process. So their first step is a pre-qualification. So that's going to involve an eligibility survey, and also some representative from the state revolving funds is going to conduct a pre-qualification meeting, which essentially is going to allow them to ask them, for them to ask you questions and for you to ask them questions, and really make sure that this is a program that's going to be able to fund the project that you want to do. So it's just meant to, make sure that you're not wasting your time applying and getting all of your required documents together. Also, there's a project needs assessment. That's kind of the next step. And a lot of states will also have this. It's kind of like a preliminary application where you will submit your, some kind of fiscal information. And in Colorado, they have fiscal sustainability certification. So just kind of some preliminary financial documents. And then, there's design and engineering, and this is often a pretty big chunk of the application process, the pre-application process. The system will complete environmental planning documents, process of design reports, and also plans and specifications. There's a lot that goes into this section, and it's very particular state by state. There's also so you have to meet requirements prior to receiving your loan application or to submitting your loan application. You're going to get document approval. You're going to hold some kind of public meeting. And this is a requirement for Colorado, not for everyone. And then when you finally submit your loan application, it's going to be reviewed by SRF staff and will hopefully be approved. And then there's the loan execution. So design and environmental clearance, and the state revolving fund executes the loan. So, these are there's a lot of steps. And like I said, they vary state by state. So this is where that early pre-qualification meeting is going to help you learn something about the process, what it's going to look like, and how to best prepare. Another component to this process that pretty much every state has is a project priority list. So every year with the publication of the intended use plan, there's going to be a list of projects that the SRF has received applications for and where those projects rank. And depending on the funding that the state has that year for their clean water SRF programs, they're going to award that money to the highest ranking applicants. And let's just look a little bit at an example of that priority ranking criteria. So in this case, we're looking at compliance issues as one of the criteria. This is for New Mexico, again, a New Mexico example. And so all states will generally have some kind of criteria, and with different levels of points that are awarded, depending on where your project falls, and how many of these points they qualify for. So compliance is usually a big one in the state revolving funds. There's also, depending on what the state wants to see, so could be also, what types of projects they are. Could be green infrastructure projects. So these kinds of things are gonna determine what your overall ranking is in relation to other projects. There's also the readiness to proceed. So a lot of states are motivated to get their SRF money out the door. They have to spend it. They federally are required to. So whether a system is ready to execute their project or not is going to also be one of the determining factors to where they rank in that list. And projects can, even once they're ranked, you can resubmit generally if you don't qualify for that if you don't qualify as high ranking in that list 1 year, you can generally reapply. But that's a little bit about that process. So if you're interested in applying for Clean Water State Revolving Fund money, here are my top 3 recommendations. So number 1, find out the important state-specific information on the Clean Water State Revolving Fund that you're applying for. So things like program goals, subsidies, loan rates, and the list of criteria that the program uses to evaluate applicants. Also, you're going to want to find out about important dates, look for additional handouts. Some states have webinar recordings that describe their whole process. And then also maybe go ahead and download the initial application. And a lot of this information is going to be on your state's Clean Water State Revolving Fund website. If you have a project in mind, you need to find out all of the documents that will be required in the application. It will depend on the project type. So if it's not spelled out in your IUP or online, then you'll need to get in touch with your state's Clean Water State Revolving Fund program. This is a step that I really do stress because all states have staff that are particularly hired to talk to potential applicants and answer questions and things like that. And also you can get in touch with us for help. We are TA providers. We're here to offer free, no-cost assistance to any small tribal or tribal system that needs assistance with this type of funding. So do feel free to reach out to us as well. We have a couple of resources that I want to share with you all. So one, especially if you're one of those people who answered yes, I think it would be useful to me, the Clean Water State Revolving Fund. Check out we have a 2023 Clean Water State Revolving Fund workshop series. That's webinars like this. They're about an hour long, all recorded, and they're all available for free online. Let me go ahead and I think you should be able to drop that in the chat. It's a YouTube channel of the Environmental Finance Center network, of which the Southwest EFC is part of. Great, that's it. That's dropped in the chat now. So if you're curious about going into more detail on each of the steps of the application process, it goes into way more detail about federal requirements, about the IUP, about what to do, how to manage your money after your grant has been awarded, things like this is all going to be in that workshop series. So check that out. We also have a state revolving fund switchboard, which is a sort of one-stop shop for all sorts of important information about the SRFs state by state. So I'll just go ahead and show you that really quick here. It's on our website. Sorry, thank you, Lou. It is a loan. This is a loan program, just to clarify. I think I misspoke just a second ago, didn't I? It's a loan program. So this is our state revolving fund switchboard. It's in the link in the chat just above here. Go ahead and click on your state. And once you click on your state, it'll take you to a page with all sorts of relevant documents to the state revolving fund programs. You'll have a bunch of PDF downloads of your state's legislation, of intended use plans, project priority lists, annual reports, all sorts of stuff. I will say that we're currently in the process of updating this whole website and all of the documents on it. There may be some intended use plans that are listed in here from a couple of years ago. They might be like from 2020 or 2022. If your state's IUP is out of date, you can also navigate straight to your state's Clean Water State Revolving Fund website from this page. So you just go ahead and click on that link on our SRF switchboard and it'll take you straight to the website. You can also Google it. But like I said, this is a one-stop shop. It's got all of your state's files very clearly organized. Not all states are that organized in terms of providing their documents, so this can be useful in that case. So again, I just want to reiterate, we're here to help you navigate this process. If you choose to pursue Clean Water State Revolving Fund money or any other kind of funding, and we do this at no cost to you. So here's my contact info. Here's Matt's contact info. And you can also learn more on our website and request assistance by going to this link up on the top of the screen. You could also QR code this little box here, if you know how to do that. And yeah, thanks everyone for showing up today, and I'm available and Matt's available to answer any questions if you have them.